Conan's a force of nature. The kind of guy that all of us want to be but can't be.
Conan is the ultimate take no crap kind of guy.
Anything you throw at him, he survives and comes back and gets you.
And when you first see Schwarzenegger, it's like the camera's looking at a building.
The movie did tremendous things for people's awareness of the character and for locking Conan into the public's mind.
It was fascinating to watch. Big horses, big swords, big dogs, big world.
When Robert E. Howard wrote the first Conan story, he was about 25 or 26 years old. He was in a small town in Texas, Cross Plains, Texas.
He lived in a flat, fairly uninteresting part of Texas in the midst of the Great Depression. And perhaps not liking the world he was in very much, he set his mind off on spectacular paths and envisioned worlds that couldn't possibly have existed, but boy, wouldn't have been something if they had.
Howard created Conan relatively late in his career, and he was writing for Weird Tales magazine, and the Conan stories in Weird Tales were his most popular series. He did one after another.
If it hadn't been for Conan, Howard probably would have been forgotten. He would have just been considered another very good pulp writer of his day. But Howard virtually invented the sword and sorcery genre single-handed.
It's not as if there aren't precedents. I mean, you'll find them in the Arabian Nights and in King Arthur and a lot of other places. But he put them together with a relatively modern sensibility.
Howard took mythology and welded it with history.
Trying to mirror battles or events or the way we know history to have unfolded with Rome and Greece, and then lace it with magic.
Robert E. Howard's prose was really quite poetic.
He just had something, an incredible vitality, vocabulary, and way of painting word pictures.
He was able to just sketch in a moment, like you're going into the ruins of some megalithic city. And he could do that in a paragraph.
He really made the sweat, blood, and passion and anger and violence come through.
People who corresponded with Robert E. Howard felt that he really did live through his creations.
When Conan came along, he just kind of came full-blown into his imagination, and it was almost like Conan was channeled through him.
It's as if when he's writing these stories, Conan just came up, he's working at the typewriter, stood in back of his shoulder, and told him the adventures.
I think he identified with Conan most. I think Conan really was much more Howard than most of his other characters. And that doesn't actually make Howard a nicer person for it, because Conan was inclined to do rather a lot of smiting, and solved most of his problems with a broadsword.
He was a big guy. He wasn't necessarily extremely tall, but he was kind of a burly guy.
He boxed, he practiced knife throwing religiously, he lifted weights. He was keenly interested in this whole physical being.
There's no question about it that he was a true Texan in his ordinary life, which would have emphasized the virtues of hunting, shooting, and fishing. He just put it all into Conan.
A writer who can come up with a new variant of the hero and make it stick in the culture, pretty unusual. And Howard created a new kind of hero, the barbarian.
Conan was such a basic elemental hero. He had this kind of rough idea of good and evil.
He was far from being, politically correct in almost any way, even for his own day.
He was more of I take what I want, and to hell with you.
Doesn't say much and doesn't express much sentimentality, but when the chips are down, he does the right thing. He always winds up saving the person that he says he's not going to save.
When he ended up on the side of right in a lot of the stories, sometimes it seemed almost by accident. He was fighting the monster because it was trying to kill him, not because it might be out to take over the world.
The essence of Conan is passion. That this is not a guy who has to think through what he's going to do a lot. What he most desires to do is generally what he needs to do. That guy over there, he needs killing. got to knock him down, got to save that girl.
He's the original anti-hero. And you got to consider, this is the 1930s, so you didn't have a lot of anti-heroes prior to this period of time.
He's very much an American character. He goes right back to Fenimore Cooper and the Last of the Mohicans and that kind of thing, where the noble savage, untainted by civilization, comes into civilization or encounters civilization and doesn't much like it.
I think, the universal appeal of that sort of character is the kind of the no-nonsense sort of attitude. I think we all have that sort of fantasy. If I looked better, was stronger, didn't take crap from anybody, and I could just be this force running amok on the land. How great would that be?
He just wanted to have a drink and a wench, and that's all he wanted. And I think people could kind of relate to that. He's just a guy like them. He's Joe Sixpack with a few more muscles and a sword and a colorful life.
Conan was popular among the readers in the 1930s during Weird Tales, and then he seemed to fall away. He became popular again in the 1960s with the Ace paperbacks with the great Frank Frazetta covers.
I think Frazetta's images were almost as equally important as Robert E. Howard's prose in selling the original books.
And created an interest in the comic book world. So you had Marvel Comics taking up Conan, Roy Thomas writing those.
Usually Marvel Comics made up its characters. I mean, Spider-Man or the Hulk or whatever. We got interested in him because he had heroism, beautiful women, and monsters, which isn't too much unlike what Spider-Man or the Hulk might be fighting. And it created a whole new audience.
Without the comics, I doubt we would have had this movie. And of course, the movie made Conan huge.
When the Conan the Barbarian movie was made, big budget Hollywood movie, that was a moment in time when people realized, this is it. Howard's made it. Conan's made it.
The big reason that Conan fits so many different media so well is that he's so visual. He's tall, he's broad-shouldered, he's muscular, he looks different from the people around him.
Arnold visually is a magnificent Conan. I thought he moved wonderfully. The way he absolutely owns the space that he's in, he is Conan.
If you see the covers of the Conan from Weird Tales, I mean, he's almost like some sort of skinny Roman guy. I actually think Howard would like the way that Schwarzenegger looks in these movies.
In a loincloth movie, which I suppose Conan was the next kind of big loincloth movie after the Tarzan movies, you really do need somebody with a good body, and I think that was what Schwarzenegger brought to the movies.
That massive frame, that 6-foot physique, and a face that's seen a few fights.
Conan was an absolutely straightforward character, which is a lot of his appeal. And Schwarzenegger played the character as the character was described.
Conan is not a talker. I thought they did a really smart thing in stripping down his dialogue and getting him down to a few words so that he was just acting rather than explaining his actions.
On the set one day, Arnold said, he said, I'm not a well-established and trained actor, so you must treat me, he said to John Milius, like a trained dog. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to remember lines. I want you to tell me exactly what to do. And when I saw this, it was working. And I said to John Milius, I said, that works pretty good. Treat me like a trained dog, too. Nothing John Milius wanted more than to be able to treat somebody like a trained dog.
Schwarzenegger, he was able to get that brooding quality that's in the stories by making him kind of patient, with his kind of barbarian patience, is the sort of thing that an Apache learns to trap game, to deal with the wild. You need an enormous amount of patience. You need to be still for a lot of the time. And I think that particular kind of stillness, and then that sudden movement, that sudden springing into action, which is exactly right for that kind of character, Schwarzenegger was perfect for.
Conan doesn't seem to have a limit on himself, more like a wild animal that'll do what it has to do to survive, what it has to do to escape.
And Howard knew that. He knew that you needed a character like this to be able to survive in the world he's creating, to overcome these obstacles he's throwing in front of him.
Conan is not going to give up. He's not the kind of man who gives up. In the movie, he's nailed to the cross. He has nowhere to go.
A vulture comes down finally to peck his eyes out, and he rips his throat out with his teeth. Okay, this is like a Howardian high point.
Conan is smart and he's and he's strong, and yet he has this sort of naivety, which is then compared with this kind of dark sophistication of the sorcerers.
Conan just hates magic. Conan wishes it didn't exist. He has contempt for it. It's a way of calling in power that isn't your own.
He was afraid of magic, which made him very human. He really stayed away from magic, but of course it kept following. It seemed like he was always getting embroiled with it.
There's warmth and fire.
But he didn't like sorcerers. He didn't like the things they did.
Do you not wish to warm yourself by my fire?
He doesn't want to fight by proxy. He wants to be right up there in your face. So magic is kind of a way of cheating.
Civilization, ancient and wicked. Have you ever seen this before?
No. Let's waste no time.
Conan lives in something that was called the Hyborian Age. And that's supposed to be, well, perhaps 12,000, 15,000 years ago, in some sort of fictitious time that's supposed to lie between the sinking of Atlantis and the rise of recorded history.
Somebody said, I think, that Howard's historical period covered something like 3,000 years of history, and that Conan wasn't just visiting exotic places, he was also visiting, he was almost time traveling.
Pick, Stone Age to medieval to even bits of Renaissance Europe, put it all in a blender, and then add 3 tablespoons of fantasy, so that there's enough fantasy to make it fantastic, but there's enough reality to make it believable.
One example of both Howard and Milius mining the same historical material. Conan sitting on top of a podium, and the Hun warrior says, "Conan, what is best in life?" And he says,
"To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women."
That's a quote directly out of a semi-biography of Genghis Khan, written by Harold Lamb, which coincidentally is a book that Robert E. Howard read and admired. Milius was now sharing the same mindset that Howard was. So there's some good intersections between him and Howard all throughout the movie like that.
John wanted to morph cultures, so he had me wearing a sort of a Teutonic lord's hairstyle, just to mess with your head, just to set you back in another time.
The look of the movie is gorgeous in places. There's some wonderful set pieces in there. The production design by Ron Cobb and Bill Stout, it's wonderful. Every little piece of jewelry, every weapon has a look that's not exactly tied to any historical period, but carries the flavor of other times.
And the movie really does well with the scenes of the cities, these thriving bazaars.
Ron Cobb created dwellings in people's clothes in the days when there weren't many nails. You used a nail for your sword. You didn't waste a nail on your house. You thongs and tied together logs and very rugged sort of homemade house creations, And that fascinated me.
When you see Arnold pushing the wheel around by himself, it's like you really understand where Howard was coming from and where the age and the sort of the land and the whole setting really works.
I think the world of Conan is imagined with quite good attention to the books, and I think it would take a much bigger budget to populate the Conan stories as thoroughly as they were populated in the books. But given how they were done, I think they managed to get a very good atmosphere.
As far as I'm concerned, I could have just watched the film without dialogue, because it was so rich with people like Arnold and his crew and his compatriots, muscle builders with their hammers and their swords.
lot of successes came out of the film in the things it's inspired later.
Most filmgoers had never seen anything like Conan before. And I think what was done in those films was pretty admirable.
After this film came out, there were a lot of knockoff films that came out afterwards.
You had, of course, the second Conan movie. You had Red Sonja, among sort of the Howard-related materials.
Virtually every plot that came after the Conan movies was some form of the Conan plot. And there are defining movies like that, there's no question of it. They set an entire genre into process.
I've seen a lot of films that take different parts of Conan. Obviously, the production design, it lives on to this day. You see a certain amount of it even in Lord of the Rings.
Those movies have this darker Howardian sensibility to them. They're not strictly pure Tolkien. They have this dirt and this grime going that Tolkien didn't have that much interest in.
Conan kind of awoke Hollywood up to the fact that there is this audience out there that's going to go see this stuff, and Lord of the Rings, is kind of the crowning achievement of that snowball that started to roll with Conan back in the 80s.
Being able to have the character move into these other media is incredibly important in terms of the survival, the cultural penetration of the name.
There's nothing else like him. There's nothing else like him in literature. There's nothing else like him in the movies.
100 years from now, the story of a barbarian taking on entrenched power and kicking its ass is still going to be a popular thing.
Conan endures because people need heroes. Conan is the guy that gets knocked down, trampled on, and then comes back, and as he said, he never met a monster yet that couldn't be killed with steel if he got it in the right place.
So few people, writers or filmmakers, can create a character that will last for decades. And the Conan character is more well-known now than he ever has been in the past.
He is the barbarian. James Bond is the secret agent, and Conan is the barbarian, and really there hasn't been anyone to replace him.
I probably would never have written my Ulrich stories the way I wrote them if it hadn't been for the existence of the Conan stories. They totally defined the fantasy genre.